What if I told you that everything you've been taught about death, every sermon, every textbook, every quiet whisper in the dark, was carefully constructed to keep you asleep? You weren't just misled about what happens when your body stops breathing, you were programmed to never ask. From the moment you became conscious of the world around you, death was framed as the end. A tragic, inevitable finale, sometimes a punishment, sometimes a reward, sometimes just a void, but always presented to you in ways that made you feel powerless, fragile, helpless. And here's the disturbing truth most people never question. Why? Why is something so universal, so intimate, so guaranteed, also the most mysterious and taboo? Why do entire institutions exist to sanitize it, mythologize it, and bury it, literally and symbolically? You were handed a narrative, a carefully designed script. Maybe you were told there's a heaven waiting for you if you behave well enough. Or that you'll be reborn into another life based on some vague cosmic tally sheet. Or perhaps you were told there's simply nothing after this, that the lights go out and you disappear into dust. But regardless of the version you were given, one thing remained consistent. The conclusion was meant to silence you, not awaken you. You were never invited to explore, you were warned not to. Death became a topic you only whisper about in funerals, movies, and fleeting late-night thoughts you quickly push away. It became untouchable, like a sacred boundary guarded by fear. And that fear, it didn't come from truth, it came from design. Religious structures told you to obey, so you could be saved later. Governments told you to contribute and conform while you're still breathing. Medicine told you that death is a failure, a thing to delay at all costs, never to understand. These systems weren't created to empower you. They were built to keep you inside a loop of dependence, distraction, and quiet compliance. And at the center of that loop is the ultimate lever of control, your fear of what comes after. But what if death isn't an end at all? What if death is a shift? Not the closing of a book, but the turning of a page. You weren't taught to ask that. In fact, you were discouraged from even entertaining it, because if you realized what death actually was, what it actually does, you'd start living very differently. You'd stop being afraid. You'd stop being so easy to manage. You'd begin to wake up. And that's exactly what happened to one man who broke through. He didn't read about it in scripture. He didn't theorize it in a lab. He didn't hallucinate under psychedelics or meditate on a mountain. He left his body. And he came back with something most people never bring: evidence. Now, let me be clear. This isn't a tale of religious revelation. It's not about miracles or divine judgment. It's about structure, systems, patterns, and most disturbingly of all, design. He discovered that what lies beyond death isn't chaos. It isn't blissful paradise, nor eternal punishment. It's organized. It's mapped. It operates by rules that mirror, in eerie ways, the systems you're part of while you're alive. But here's the catch. Those rules don't serve you, they contain you. And when you start to understand that, something inside you shifts. You begin to feel it. That quiet, aching suspicion that you've felt since childhood. The sense that something about all this never quite made sense. Why would your soul, something infinite, be judged based on a few decades of confusion and indoctrination? Why would eternal punishment be the answer to temporary ignorance? Why would an all-loving universe ask for obedience under threat? The deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. None of these questions have ever been answered truthfully. They've only been answered conveniently. Because, if you weren't afraid of death, the world as it is would begin to crumble. Think about how much of your life is shaped by the fear of endings, the urgency to succeed quickly, the terror of sickness, the need to find purpose before it's too late. Think about how death is sold to you, wrapped in romanticized tragedy or clinical detachment, but always presented as something final. Now imagine learning that it isn't final. Not even close. Imagine being shown that death is just a membrane, a thin veil between layers of consciousness, and that what waits on the other side isn't judgment, but architecture. That there are zones, realms, corridors of existence, each crafted by awareness itself. Some people go through that veil and wake up, others fall asleep even deeper, and the difference between the two, awareness. Not belief, not religion, not how many times you went to church or whether you bowed the right way, awareness. You were told not to seek this, told it was dangerous, told it was heresy. But that's because those who programmed your reality don't want you knowing what you really are. They don't want you asking what this place really is, because if you knew, you'd stop playing the game. That's why death had to be turned into a horror story. That's why your questions were met with silence, or worse, with pre-written answers designed to keep you docile. But now, the script is breaking. More and more people are having experiences they can't explain away. Near-death events that defy science. Out of body journeys that leave them transformed. Encounters with guides, structures, and layers of being that don't fit into any religious dogma, and they're coming back changed. Not just spiritually awakened, but liberated. Because once you know that you are not your body, once you've tasted the continuity of your consciousness, once you've seen the machinery running behind the veil, you can never go back. You no longer fear death, you respect it. You prepare for it. You begin to see it not as an end, but as a test, a mirror, a checkpoint. And just like in life, most people aren't ready for that test, because they've spent their lives believing the lie. And that lie, that carefully constructed story about fire and clouds and nothingness, that was never about helping you. It was about controlling you. You've been sleepwalking through your existence, terrified of what comes next. But here's the truth, you were never supposed to hear. You've already died before. You've already crossed over, many times, and each time you did, you came back to learn something new. You are not here for the first time. You are not here by accident. And when you leave this body, you will not be gone. You will awaken, or you will repeat. But this time, maybe you choose to remember. And that's where this journey begins. He wasn't a monk. He wasn't a guru sitting cross-legged under a Bodhi tree. He wasn't whispering ancient chants on a mountaintop. He was a businessman, a sharp, pragmatic media executive grounded firmly in the world of ratings, deadlines, and the tangible. His name was Robert Monroe, and he never set out to become a spiritual pioneer. In fact, had you asked him at the beginning of his journey whether he believed in anything mystical or metaphysical, he probably would have shrugged it off as fantasy. He wasn't looking for enlightenment. He was just looking for answers to questions he never intended to ask. And yet, one night, everything changed. There was no warning, no spiritual awakening, no prior belief system to prepare him. One evening, lying in bed like he had done thousands of times before, something cracked, something shifted, and he found himself floating above his own body. At first, the sensation was terrifying, the separation so jarring, so physical, it felt like death itself. He could see his body below him, motionless and unaware, as though he had somehow become the observer of his own life. Panic surged through him. Was he dying? Was this some kind of neurological malfunction? Or worse, had he lost his mind? The experience ended, but the questions didn't, and when it happened again, then again, he realized this wasn't a one-off anomaly. Whatever it was real. Real in a way that forced him to question every assumption he had about life, consciousness, and reality itself. He hadn't sought this out. The experience had come for him, and it wasn't finished. These out-of-body episodes began repeating with startling consistency. They weren't dreams, they carried more clarity than waking life. They weren't hallucinations, they followed patterns, structures, and laws. Monroe began documenting them. Night after night, he recorded what he saw, what he felt, what he encountered. What began as bewilderment quickly evolved into curiosity, then into obsession. He realized something few people ever do. His consciousness was not confined to his physical body. It could travel. It could observe. It could navigate realms that existed far beyond the five senses. He wasn't alone in these realms. He encountered other intelligences, some recognizable, others entirely alien. He visited places that defied the logic of earthly geography, dimensions that seemed to operate on different laws of time and space. And slowly, he began to map them. What emerged wasn't a chaotic blur of spiritual symbolism or abstract metaphor. It was a structured system, a design. And within that design, he found evidence of something deeply organized, terrifyingly organized. These weren't realms of wishful thinking or imagined heavens. They were territories, zones, layers of conscious experience. At first, Monroe questioned his own sanity. How could a media executive from Virginia suddenly become a traveler between worlds? But when he tested the repeatability of these journeys, when he documented details he couldn't have known by ordinary means, he realized that what was happening to him was not random. It was part of something much bigger, something waiting to be discovered, not just by mystics, but by anyone willing to step beyond the conditioning of the physical mind. He had no roadmap at the beginning, no mentor guiding him through these strange encounters, just his own disciplined observation and relentless curiosity. And yet, over time, he began to chart the stages of what he called non-physical reality. Each journey unveiled a new layer. Each layer revealed more about the hidden mechanics behind existence. He would later refer to these states as focus levels, discrete ranges of conscious awareness that you could move through intentionally. These weren't dream states. They were as real as touching your own skin, maybe more so. And through it all, Monroe remained methodical. This was not blind faith. This was exploration, scientific in its approach, grounded in observation. If something couldn't be repeated, it was discarded. If it could, it was logged, categorized, and examined again. What he discovered undermined everything humanity thought it knew about death, consciousness, and the soul. It wasn't mystical speculation, it was direct experience. Perhaps the most unsettling part of Monroe's discoveries wasn't just that consciousness survives death, but that it survives within a system, a structure, and that structure has rules. It has zones of control. Places where souls linger unknowingly, places where beliefs become cages, places where most people end up, not because they're meant to, but because they don't know how to do otherwise. Monroe saw people who had died, people who didn't even realize they were dead. He saw souls caught in loops, repeating the same earthly routines out of sheer habit. Soldiers stuck in endless battles. Addicts still chasing chemical ghosts. Office workers pacing empty rooms that no longer existed. He witnessed souls clinging to identity like it was armor, unable to move forward because they had never learned to let go. And yet, he pressed deeper. The further he traveled, the more he realized that awareness was the currency of movement. The more conscious you were, the more freedom you had to navigate. The less you questioned, the more likely you were to remain stuck. Monroe wasn't given answers. He found them by stepping through fear, through confusion, and into clarity. And each time he returned, he brought with him a clearer understanding of what death really was, and more importantly, what it wasn't. It wasn't oblivion, it wasn't a punishment, it wasn't even an ending. It was a transition into a far more intelligent system, a matrix of thought and energy that continues shaping your path even after the physical body dissolves. But that system, Monroe realized, wasn't neutral. It was designed, and like any design, it served a purpose. Whether that purpose is evolution or containment, freedom or control, is something you have to discover for yourself. Monroe didn't ask for this path. He didn't build a spiritual brand or sell salvation in a bottle. He simply followed the truth where it led him, even when it broke him. Even when it unraveled everything he thought he knew. And when he came back from these journeys, he didn't return with mythology. He returned with maps. He showed that death isn't the opposite of life. It's the continuation of awareness. And that awareness, if cultivated now, gives you a compass that works beyond the grave. You weren't meant to wait until your final breath to understand this. You were meant to prepare now, because just like Monroe, whether you seek the experience or not, it may one day come for you. And when it does, the question won't be whether you believe, it'll be whether you're ready. Why were you told the story of death so early, and yet warned never to question it? Think about it. Before you could write your name, before you knew how to tell time, someone had already handed you a conclusion about what happens after this life. You didn't choose it. It was assigned to you. It came in the form of bedtime stories, Sunday sermons, silent nods in hospitals, and carefully worded eulogies. Whether it was heaven, hell, reincarnation, or emptiness, the message wasn't just about what happens after death. It was about not digging any deeper, because asking meant trouble. You felt it, didn't you? That subtle shift in the room when you brought up death with too much curiosity. Adults changed the subject, teachers deferred, even spiritual leaders gave you polished answers that felt too clean, too rehearsed. You learned quickly that some questions weren't meant to be asked, not because they lacked answers, but because the answers were off limits. You were told what to believe, but more importantly, you were trained not to question why you believed it. And that's where the real control begins, not in the story itself, but in the silent force that keeps you from inspecting the story. Because what happens if you do? What happens if you pull the thread? You begin to see the patterns, the contradictions, the way every system, religion, science, education has a stake in your ignorance. You start to notice how convenient it is that you're given a fixed answer to the biggest mystery of existence before you're old enough to even understand the question. You were never meant to explore, you were meant to comply. It's not that heaven or reincarnation or nothingness are inherently false. The danger lies in how they were offered to you, as final destinations instead of investigative prompts, as containers to end your curiosity rather than portals to expand it. These concepts became placeholders, mental pacifiers to soothe you into complacency, and behind every placeholder is the unspoken command, do not ask. Because if you ask, you might start to uncover something else, something too disruptive to the system you were born into. You might realize that death is not a place, it's not a reward or a punishment, it's not even the ending, it's a mechanism, a process. And like any process, it can be observed, navigated, and understood. But if you understood it, you wouldn't be afraid of it. And if you weren't afraid of it, they couldn't control you. Fear is the leash, death is the collar, and the narrative you were handed is the invisible hand keeping it all firmly in place. But here's the unsettling truth. None of it is real in the way you were told. Because death is not a singular event, it's a transition of focus, a change in frequency. And what exists beyond it isn't decided by dogma or doctrine. It's determined by consciousness, your consciousness. Not the one defined by your identity, not the part of you that thinks it's a name, a job, a gender, a role. The real you, the silent observer behind the mask, that's who crosses the threshold, that's who sees what lies beyond the veil. And that observer has never needed religion to tell it what happens next. It already knows. But you were never taught to listen to it. Instead, you were surrounded by noise, beautiful noise, terrifying noise, intellectual noise, but noise nonetheless. You were trained to trust outer authorities rather than your inner perception. You were taught that sacred truth comes from scriptures or labs or institutions, never from your own direct experience. And so, you became afraid of silence, afraid of the stillness where truth lives. Because, in that silence, something dangerous can happen. You begin to remember. You begin to remember that you are not this single life. You are not this fragile body, destined to rot and vanish. You are not here for the first time, and you will not leave for the last. You begin to see the outlines of the system not as myth but as machinery. Death is not random. It's not chaotic. It's structured. And someone structured it. That's the question they never want you to ask. Who built the system? Who benefits from your confusion? Who profits from your fear? Because once you start asking those questions, you stop being manageable. You stop being a predictable participant in the game. You stop living in ways that serve their model of society, the version that needs you compliant, anxious, and terrified of the unknown. You become harder to manipulate, harder to sell to, harder to threaten. Because what happens when you're no longer afraid of death? You start living, fully, fearlessly, with your awareness intact. You start making choices from a place of curiosity instead of control. You begin to move not just through this world, but beyond it. And that's the real reason death was made into a taboo, not because it's unknowable, but because, knowing it changes everything. Knowing it reveals the game. It exposes the illusion. It cracks the spell that says, play nice and maybe you'll get a reward at the end. You begin to see that the reward isn't waiting after death. It's your awareness now, your clarity, your ability to perceive the architecture of this place without being imprisoned by it. But that kind of freedom doesn't come from belief. It comes from experience. And experience requires permission, the kind you never got. Because once you start exploring for yourself, through meditation, lucid dreaming, out-of-body experiences, or even near-death events, you find that the answers don't match the stories. You discover layers, levels, non-physical territories that aren't defined by morality, but by frequency. You witness beings, guides, watchers, some benevolent, some not. You realize that belief creates form, that thoughts become environments, that the afterlife is a spectrum, not a destination. And none of this is metaphor, it's structure. There are realms where souls loop endlessly, unaware they've died. There are zones built entirely from belief systems, heavens and hells that exist only because people expect them to. There are stations where awareness is deprogrammed, cleansed, and prepared for reintegration. And deeper still, there are layers so far removed from form that even memory dissolves. These are not fantasies. They are navigable, mappable, repeatable. But no one told you, because no one was supposed to. You were meant to stay curious, but not too curious. Question, but not too loudly. Believe, but never experience. But now that you're here, now that something inside you is starting to stir, you have a choice. Keep playing along with the comforting narrative, or begin the real inquiry, the one that doesn't hand you answers but demands that you uncover them yourself. Because the moment you begin asking what they never wanted you to ask, is the moment you begin to remember who you really are. And the moment you remember is the moment their illusion starts to fall apart. You've been told that death is the end, that after your final breath, there's either light or darkness, reward or punishment, heaven or hell. But what if that binary story was never the truth? What if death isn't a moment, but an entry point into something larger? A continuation into a space governed not by mystery, but by machinery. That's what Robert Monroe discovered. A system so vast, so intelligent, that it left no doubt. This was not mythology. This was engineering. Death, he realized, isn't a wall you crash into. It's a gate. And like any gate, it opens only under certain conditions. If you don't know the keys, you stay stuck on the wrong side. What Monroe stumbled into wasn't vague, symbolic mysticism. It was structured, repeatable, cold in its precision. You might expect that the afterlife would be soft and glowing, filled with ethereal clouds and unconditional love. And while love certainly exists there, it doesn't govern the system. The system operates with laws, not moral laws, design laws. These are not commandments handed down by a divine authority. These are mechanics, principles etched into the fabric of conscious evolution. And the terrifying part, most people don't know they're inside it. He found that when the body dies, the awareness doesn't dissolve. It detaches. It begins moving through a sequence of transitions, not unlike how you move from room to room in a house, each with its own atmosphere, rules, and occupants. Monroe named these territories focus levels. These are not arbitrary labels. Each level represents a distinct range of conscious frequency, and depending on where your awareness is tuned, you'll land in a specific zone, not because you're judged, because you're matched. You don't go where you want, you go where you resonate. That's the first brutal truth you have to confront. There is no external force sorting souls into categories. There's just resonance. If you carry fear, you'll match with realms built from fear. If you carry belief, you'll land in a construct shaped by that belief. If you're free, truly free, you'll find yourself in territories designed for movement, exploration, and growth. But most don't make it that far. Because most have no idea the system even exists. Monroe discovered that consciousness isn't static after death, it's fluid. But that fluidity is constrained by internal programming. Think of your consciousness like a tuning fork. The vibration you hold at the moment of death, and all the thoughts, emotions, and beliefs you've accumulated determine the next layer of your experience. It's not a judgment day, it's a handoff. You bring yourself forward, complete with all the attachments, delusions, and memories you refuse to let go of, and that cargo becomes your reality. Each layer Monroe explored revealed a level of organization that defied expectation. This wasn't the chaos of a dream state. This wasn't psychological projection. These were designed environments. Some felt digital, others ancient. Some were eerily similar to Earth, others beyond comprehension. But what unified them all was their structure. There were pathways, rules, boundaries. You could get stuck in one. You could be pulled into another. You could be helped, but you could also be detained. And in many of these zones, there was a recurring theme: stagnation, souls trapped in loops, unable to recognize where they were, unable to recognize what they were. Monroe called them belief system territories, realms where collective consciousness constructs entire environments based on expectation. If you die expecting fire and judgment, you may find yourself there. If you die waiting for golden gates and choirs, those might appear, not because they're true in any universal sense, but because belief generates form, and when enough beings believe the same thing, it solidifies into an environment. This isn't a metaphor, it's a mechanic. And mechanics don't care whether or not you're ready for them. Imagine a system where your thoughts act as architects, where your fears become walls, your hopes, ceilings, your guilt, locks. Now imagine entering that system without knowing you've died. Without understanding that what you're seeing is just a reflection of your internal state. That's what happens to most. They cross over thinking they're still alive, or thinking they've arrived at the final destination. But the truth is, they've entered a mirror. And the reflection is mercilessly accurate. In some layers, time moves differently. Monroe reported what felt like days or years passing in certain zones, only to return to physical reality and realize mere minutes had gone by. These weren't dreams, they had continuity. They had systems of communication, hierarchies, beings who played specific roles. Some helped souls transition, others acted as watchers, some observed, some interfered, and not all were benevolent. Monroe encountered guides, conscious beings not tethered to physical form, whose task was to aid the disoriented. But he also met presences that were not so kind. Entities who seemed invested in maintaining certain loops, who fed off emotional residue, who discouraged questioning. And these weren't hallucinations. These were patterns, recurrent across journeys, consistent across levels. It became increasingly clear that the system had layers not just of experience, but of intention. Some areas encouraged growth, others encouraged compliance. And some, perhaps the most dangerous, encouraged sleep. Not physical sleep, conscious sleep. The kind where you stop asking questions, where you accept the environment around you as truth, where you settle, and that's when you get trapped. Because this machinery, as intricate as it is, seems to prefer predictability. It accommodates those who fit within expected templates. Believers go to belief zones, the fearful to fearful places, the free to free spaces, but the default path, the path of the unaware, often leads to containment, not punishment, not torture, just stagnation, repetition. You think you're safe, but you're not moving. You think you've arrived, but you've only stepped into a holding pattern. And the most tragic part? Most never realize it. They accept what they see because it matches what they were told to expect, and so they stop looking, they stop questioning, they stop moving. And the system, in its silent precision, continues functioning as designed. The design doesn't judge you, it doesn't pity you, it reflects you. What Monroe saw was not a heaven or a hell, it was a labyrinth, a vast series of chambers, each tuned to a specific frequency of awareness. Some were healing spaces, some were learning centers. Some were soul prisons. The only way out was up, and the only way up was through awareness. He came to understand that awareness is the only real freedom in this system. Awareness is what lets you move between levels. Awareness is what lets you break through illusions. Awareness is what unlocks the gate. Without it, you're just another consciousness drifting, matching, mirroring, circling. The architecture Monroe revealed is not meant to scare you. It's meant to wake you, because you're already inside the system. Right now, the moment you started asking what happens after death, you entered the outskirts of it. But the deeper you look, the more responsibility you carry. Once you know the structure exists, pretending it doesn't becomes a choice, a dangerous one. You were never meant to remain in the dark. The system only remains hidden if you refuse to see. But if you choose to see, if you train your awareness now, if you prepare your consciousness while you still breathe, then when your body falls away, you won't be another wandering soul stuck in a loop. You'll be a navigator. And in a system this complex, that's the only kind of soul that ever finds freedom. What if the first time you die doesn't involve your heart stopping or your breath fading, but instead happens while your body is still very much alive? Imagine lying in bed, expecting another ordinary night, when suddenly something strange begins to happen. Your body becomes heavy, but your awareness sharpens. You're paralyzed, yet more awake than you've ever been. A strange vibration pulses through you. It's electric, like your skin is humming. Then, without warning, you feel it. A shift, a separation. It's not a thought, it's not a dream. It's a tearing sensation that leaves you floating just inches above your own sleeping form. You look down and see yourself. Not metaphorically, literally. Your body is still there, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with breath. But you are not in it anymore. You're hovering, completely conscious, completely aware, and overwhelmed by the one realization no one ever prepares you for. You are not your body. That was his first death. Not the final one, not the physical one. This was the death of the illusion. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew unraveled. There was no trumpet sound, no angel chorus, no fiery pit or blinding light. There was only silence, clarity, and an almost unbearable sense of realness, more real than anything the physical world had ever offered. The room was the same, the objects unchanged, but his perception, that had shattered into something unrecognizable. At first, panic set in. If you've never experienced your own consciousness outside your body, you can't imagine how terrifying it is. You question whether you're dying. You question whether you've gone insane. You fight to return, to snap back into something familiar. But the harder you try, the more distant your physical shell feels. In that gap between fear and understanding, something ancient begins to awaken. It's the moment you realize that the you, watching from above, is the real you, and the body below is just a vessel, a suit, a temporary avatar. And that's where the fear begins to dissolve. Slowly, not all at once, but with each moment of awareness, the terror fades, and curiosity takes its place. You begin to see that the body wasn't who you are, it was just who you pretended to be. A character in a play, a role in a script. But the observer? The one, watching, floating, feeling without flesh? That one had no name, no gender, no timeline, only presence. It was the beginning of an unmasking. Death, he would come to realize, wasn't about endings, it was about revelation. It was about seeing yourself without the filters, without the programming, without the illusions you'd spent your life believing were real. When the body is no longer the center of your identity, what's left is something raw, quiet, and endless. And what he saw in those first moments changed him forever. Because once you've stepped outside your physical form and returned, you no longer believe in life after death, you know it. You no longer speculate, you remember. It's not a matter of faith, it's a shift in direct perception. And that shift rewrites everything. You begin to question why no one told you, why this isn't taught, why it's hidden in obscure books, cloaked in taboo, dismissed as delusion. You start to understand why death has been wrapped in fear, why the afterlife is either romanticized or weaponized. Because if you had direct access to the truth, if you experienced the continuity of your consciousness firsthand, you would stop fearing death. And if you stop fearing death, you become ungovernable. The first out of body experience is more than a journey. It's a mirror. It shows you the gap between who you've been told you are and what you actually are. It shows you how fragile identity is when it's based on physical experience alone, and it forces you to confront the terrifying, liberating fact that you are not bound by the rules of this world. He didn't ask for it. He didn't summon it through ritual. He wasn't on a spiritual pilgrimage or deep in meditation. It just happened, uninvited, unfiltered, undeniable. And maybe that's why it shook him so deeply, because it stripped away every pretense. There were no holy symbols or metaphysical language to hide behind, just the raw truth that awareness does not depend on biology. You could be lying perfectly still, heart beating, brain functioning, and yet your essence, your being, is somewhere else, watching. He would later come to understand that this experience was not unique. Others have had it, many more than you'd think, but most are too afraid to talk about it, too afraid of being labeled, dismissed, shamed, because our culture doesn't have room for these truths. It only has boxes, religion, science, psychology, and anything that doesn't fit gets sealed shut. But once you've floated above your own body, you no longer fit into those boxes. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unfeel what it felt like. And the most unsettling part? You recognize that space. It feels familiar, like you've been there before, like this wasn't the first time you left the body, only the first time you noticed. And that realization opens up something even more profound. What if death isn't the first time you die? What if you've died hundreds of times, between lives, between dreams, in other realms, and every time you just forgot? What if this life is just another excursion? The first out of body experience makes you question not just death, but life. You start to see how limited our definitions are. We think living means breathing, moving, doing. But what if true living is consciousness without filters? What if true death isn't about losing the body, but losing awareness? He would go on to have hundreds of these experiences, voluntarily, with precision, with purpose. But none would ever match the intensity of that first break, because it wasn't just the beginning of exploration, it was the end of certainty, the moment when the veil tore open, not from study or ritual, but from spontaneous contact with what's real. And for the rest of his life, he would carry that knowing, not as a belief, but as a burden and a gift. Because once you know, you can never unknow. Once you die before you die, you stop being afraid of the final breath. You realize that death is not the curtain, it's the spotlight. It's the moment when the show ends and the lights come on, and you're left standing there, mask off, eyes wide, finally seeing the stage for what it really was. And when that moment comes again, for real, there's only one thing that determines how you pass through it, whether you've remembered who you are, or whether you're still playing the role. What if everything you consider real is only one thin layer of a much deeper structure? What if this life, your job, your name, your story, is just the surface level of a much more intricate design? Robert Monroe didn't speculate about this, he went there. Over and over again, he crossed the boundary between physical and non-physical existence. Not through theory or belief, but through direct experience. And what he uncovered wasn't a blurry realm of symbolic visions or dreamlike hallucinations, it was a map, a structured sequence of realities, organized by measurable states of awareness. He called them focus levels, not because it sounded mystical, but because they represented specific bandwidths of consciousness. These weren't made up, they were consistent, they were navigable, and each one revealed another piece of a system that most people don't even know they're inside. Monroe's early journeys began close to the physical plane. He'd leave his body at night and hover inches above it, fully conscious, aware, watching himself sleep. That alone is enough to rupture a lifetime of beliefs, but that was just the starting point. As he learned to stabilize his awareness, he began to push further, beyond his bedroom walls, beyond the city he lived in, beyond even the boundaries of Earth. And as he moved, he noticed something strange. These weren't random experiences. They had architecture, they had borders, they had their own logic and rules. It was as if he was tuning his consciousness to different frequencies, and with each adjustment, he accessed a different level of existence. These levels were not random dreamscapes. They were territories, each one distinct, each one inhabited. Focus. Level 1 is what you're in now. Physical waking reality. The world as you know it, shaped by your 5 senses and interpreted through your conditioned mind. Most people never move beyond it. But if you've ever meditated deeply, lost track of your body, or felt yourself expand beyond form, you've tasted the edges of a higher focus. From there, the levels begin to branch outward, and each jump brings you into a reality less governed by physical matter and more influenced by energy, thought, and vibration. Some of these levels are only slightly removed from Earth. They still carry echoes of the physical world, and the souls who inhabit them often don't realize they've passed on. They walk, talk, and behave as if they're still alive, going through the motions of their former lives, unaware that their bodies have long since decayed. In these early levels, Monroe encountered souls who were stuck in routine. Office workers, still organizing papers at invisible desks. Addicts, still looking for a fix they no longer had a body to feel. Soldiers, still reliving their final battles, thinking the war hadn't ended. These weren't metaphorical images, they were real encounters, repeated across multiple explorations. These souls weren't evil or damned, they were simply unaware. Their consciousness hadn't evolved past the identity they carried in life, and because of that, they couldn't move on. The system, Monroe realized, doesn't punish you. It matches you. If you die believing that your identity is all you are, that your job, your habits, your fears define you, then you carry that vibration into the next realm. And that frequency tunes you into a level where those patterns continue, without interruption. The death of the body doesn't erase the program, it only removes the interface. The code remains, running silently, projecting reality around you, until something shakes you awake. As Monroe moved further out, he began to reach levels where the physical world lost its grip entirely. These were realms of raw thought, of unfiltered energy, of consciousness without anchors. Here, time became elastic, space became optional. Some areas were filled with beings, intelligent, aware, non-physical entities who interacted with him consciously. Others were empty, vast plains of silence and stillness, as if waiting to be created into form. And it was in these higher bands of awareness that Monroe began to understand the larger structure at play. Each focus level was like a different room in a massive, multi-dimensional house, but not all rooms were created equal. Some were warm, peaceful, designed for healing and integration. Others were sterile, mechanical, even hostile to higher awareness. Some served as educational hubs, where souls gathered to study past lives, future timelines, or the fabric of reality itself. Others were containment fields, zones where belief systems crystallized into artificial heavens or hells. The diversity was staggering. And yet, each zone obeyed a kind of logic, a vibrational alignment that determined who entered, who stayed, and who could move on. One of the most disturbing patterns Monroe observed was how many souls didn't even realize they were dead. They wandered these levels in a fog, repeating behaviors from their earthly lives, locked into loops of memory and expectation. They hadn't been judged, they hadn't been damned, they were simply unaware. And because they lacked awareness, they couldn't change their state. They couldn't question the scenery around them. They couldn't challenge the beliefs that held them in place. To them, this was life. Just a continuation of what came before, with minor differences they either ignored or explained away. And then there were the guided zones. Monroe found that some areas were staffed, with non-physical beings, whose role was to assist souls in transition. These guides would appear to the newly dead, sometimes in forms they recognized, a deceased relative, a religious figure, a being of light. Their goal wasn't to manipulate, but to orient, to help the soul understand where they were and what came next. But even these guides couldn't force awakening. The soul had to choose awareness, and many didn't. That's what Monroe came to see as the greatest tragedy of death, not the pain of loss, not the fear of judgment, but the continuation of unconsciousness. People who spent their lives asleep simply transferred that sleep into the next realm. They didn't wake up just because their bodies failed. In fact, in many cases, the death process only deepened the illusion, giving them a new environment that matched their expectations so perfectly they never thought to question it. The focus levels weren't destinations, they were mirrors. They reflected the contents of your consciousness with brutal precision, and the only way to move forward was to become aware of what you were carrying. Awareness was the vehicle. Without it, you stayed put, or worse, you circled endlessly, thinking you were evolving when you were simply orbiting your own illusions. Monroe's mapping of these realms wasn't done casually. He cross-referenced experiences, he revisited levels, he documented changes, he compared encounters. Over time, the pattern became undeniable. The afterlife wasn't random, it was structured, it was designed to reflect, and its ultimate purpose, if it had one, seemed to be growth through self-realization. But only if you chose it. Only if you saw through the projections and asked the one question that changes everything. What am I beyond my thoughts, my memories, and my beliefs? If you never ask that question, the system won't force you. It will let you play out your beliefs until you tire of them. It will give you the heaven you expected or the hell you feared. It will let you wear your old name, your old fears, your old regrets like a costume. And it will wait, because the system doesn't evolve you. It gives you the space to evolve yourself. That's the terrifying brilliance of it all. It's not a prison, it's a mirror house. You don't escape by running, you escape by seeing. And once you start to see, really see, you begin to move. You begin to wake up, and the further you wake, the more levels become available to you. Not because you earned it, because you matched it. What if I told you that when most people die, they don't even know it? They cross over, not into some heavenly light or fiery abyss, but into a fog, a space that looks eerily like the life they just left. And in that fog, they keep living as if nothing happened. Addicts still searching for their next fix, soldiers still trapped in battlefields long erased from Earth, office workers wandering invisible cubicles, endlessly checking clocks that no longer tick. Not because they've been damned or judged, not because they did something wrong, but simply because they never woke up. You've been told that death is a moment, a clean break, a passage from one world to another, but the truth is far more unsettling. Death doesn't always bring clarity. For many, it brings confusion, disorientation, a repetition of the life they just left, not in physical form, but in habit, in mindset, in belief. The soul doesn't suddenly gain wisdom just because the body shuts down. In fact, if the mind was clouded in life, if it was trained to believe only in what it could touch, see, and fear, it often carries that same blindness into death. That's what exists in what's been called Focus 23, a realm not of torment, but of loops of consciousness stuck in cycles of behavior, emotion, and identity. Imagine a man who worked the same job for 40 years, defined himself by a title, a desk, a routine. Now, imagine him dying suddenly, without any spiritual preparation, without ever questioning what he truly is. When his body goes, his consciousness doesn't leap into the stars. It returns to the only structure it knows, his office. He walks the same halls, answers phones that no longer ring, feels the same stress he did in life. To him, nothing has changed. He doesn't question it. Why would he? Questioning wasn't part of his program. Now imagine a woman addicted to alcohol or drugs. Her life ended in turmoil, in need, in longing. When she dies, that craving doesn't dissolve. Her body might be gone, but the energy of addiction, the memory of it, the pull of it, still clings to her consciousness. And so she roams, looking for sensation, for escape, for access to something that might make her feel alive again. But she doesn't realize she's not alive. She's caught between desire and emptiness, never knowing why she feels so restless. And then there are the soldiers, men and women who died in war, in violence, in trauma. When they pass, they often find themselves in landscapes that mirror their final moments, still fighting, still hiding, still reliving the chaos. To them, the war hasn't ended. The enemy is still out there, the mission is still underway, and unless something disrupts that loop, they remain locked in that experience indefinitely. These aren't punishments handed down by some divine figure. They're echoes of belief, of identity, of emotion. They're the byproduct of dying while still clinging to form. The tragedy is not that these souls are suffering, it's that they don't even know they're free. You might wonder how this is possible. How can someone die and not know it? But ask yourself this: how many people live without knowing who they are? How many walk through life asleep, going through the motions, reacting to conditioning rather than responding to truth? If someone spends their life unconscious, why would death suddenly make them aware? It doesn't. Consciousness carries momentum. If you live in loops, you die into loops. If you never question your reality while alive, you won't start doing it just because your heart stops. The only thing that truly dies is the body. The mind, the ego, the unresolved trauma, they don't disappear. They follow you, unless you've learned to let go. That's why awareness is everything. It's not about how good or bad you were. It's not about morality or sin. It's about clarity. The more aware you are in life, the more mobile you are in death. The more anchored you are to belief, identity, and habit, the more likely you are to get stuck. And that's exactly what the system counts on. The world you live in isn't designed to make you conscious. It's designed to keep you distracted. Distracted by work, by entertainment, by fear, by hope. It teaches you to build a life around roles: parent, spouse, employee, citizen, and then tells you those roles are who you are. But they're not. They're costumes. Useful, maybe, but temporary. When death comes and the costume falls away, the ones who never learned to separate from their role experience panic. They reach for something to define them. And in the absence of the physical, the subconscious becomes the projector. It recreates reality from memory, from belief, from habit. And so they loop. A soul might spend what feels like years replaying a job, a relationship, a trauma, not because they're being punished, but because they're still identifying with it. They haven't learned to step back, to observe, to release. But not all is lost in these realms. Sometimes, souls in these loops get visited by guides, by aware beings, sometimes even by living people who know how to travel non-physically. These visitors don't save or rescue, they remind. They bring presence into the loop. They create a ripple in the fog. And in that ripple, sometimes, just sometimes, a soul pauses, questions, notices something is off. That moment of questioning is everything. It's the beginning of awakening, the beginning of movement. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer fully inside it. You become the witness. And the moment you become the witness, the loop begins to lose its grip. But make no mistake, most don't reach that moment, not right away, because the conditioning is deep. The pain, the fear, the addiction, it can feel more real than the truth. And the system allows it, not because it's evil, but because it's neutral. It responds to what you hold on to. It reflects your consciousness. So, if you believe in punishment, you might create it. If you expect judgment, you might face it. If you're certain you're unworthy, you might find yourself in a realm that mirrors that. But none of it is eternal. It's all self-sustained. And what sustains it is ignorance. That's why it matters what you believe, but more importantly, what you question. Because belief can be a cage, but questioning, that's the key. This is why spiritual preparation isn't about memorizing doctrine. It's about cultivating awareness. It's about knowing how to observe without clinging, to feel without drowning. To recognize that who you are is not the story, the emotion, or the identity. It's the field in which all of those arise. You are the space, not the form. And the more you remember that in life, the more you'll remember it in death. Because death doesn't give you wisdom. It gives you opportunity. Opportunity to continue, to shift, to evolve. But you have to recognize the opening. You have to notice that the room you're in isn't real. That the battle you're still fighting ended long ago. That the craving you feel isn't a curse. It's a misunderstanding. You're not being punished. You're being mirrored. And once you see that, once you really see it, the loop dissolves. You move forward. Not because someone saves you, not because a deity grants you release, but because you wake up. And that waking up, It begins now, not after your body is gone. Now, imagine crossing over after death, only to find yourself in the exact version of the afterlife you were taught as a child. Golden gates, angels, streets paved in light, or maybe fire, judgment, an eternal echo of guilt and shame. At first, it would seem like proof, confirmation. You might think, it was all true. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a trap, a self-constructed loop, powered not by divine will, but by your own unquestioned beliefs? This is what Robert Monroe discovered in what he called focus levels, 24 through 26, a cluster of territories not governed by truth, but by thought, not crafted by gods, but constructed by belief itself. These levels, as Monroe observed, were structured environments shaped entirely by collective expectation. Souls who believed deeply in a specific doctrine, a religious system, an ideological framework, arrived in realms that mirrored those beliefs with chilling precision. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal. Believers in fiery judgment found themselves in landscapes of fire and punishment. Those who expected eternal rest under divine light walked through glowing meadows, surrounded by robed figures and sacred hymns. Those who feared purgatory found themselves suspended in waiting rooms of confusion, time stretching endlessly as they awaited a verdict that never came. The environments looked divine, felt holy, carried the weight of prophecy, but they weren't sourced from divine origin. They were the products of consciousness, of mental architecture solidified by mass agreement. In these territories, belief acts like gravity. The more deeply a soul clings to its convictions, the more rooted it becomes in the environment that reflects them. And this is where the trap tightens. You might think that faith would lead to liberation, that religious conviction, even in death, would guide you toward some final peace. But in these zones, faith does not free you, it cages you. Because the more certain you are that your experience is the ultimate truth, the less likely you are to question it. And the system thrives on that. It doesn't need to deceive you. It only needs you to deceive yourself. That's what makes these territories so dangerous. They feel real. They respond to your thoughts. They reward your obedience. If you believed your entire life that salvation came through submission, then that is exactly what the environment will offer. A system where you're rewarded for kneeling, praised for your silence, comforted for staying within the lines, but it's all a closed loop. There's no growth, no forward movement, only repetition of the same spiritual conditioning you carried in life. You aren't being punished, but you aren't evolving either. The illusion is perfect because it's tailored to you. That's the brilliance of belief system territories. They aren't enforced by external rulers. They are authored by the very souls who dwell within them. Every image, every law, every guardian or gatekeeper you encounter is a reflection of internal architecture, yours and that of the collective you've aligned with. Think of a massive network of souls, all vibrating with the same belief system. Their combined thought energy manifests the landscape. It becomes self-sustaining, and once inside, the individual loses perspective. The dream becomes real. The metaphor becomes a prison. This is not theoretical. Monroe visited these zones many times. He spoke to beings trapped within them, souls who had no idea they were in a construct. They weren't suffering, but they weren't free. They were waiting for something, a rapture, a savior, a divine judgment that would never come because the system they were in didn't operate on those laws. It operated on resonance. And as long as they resonated with dogma, hierarchy, fear, they remained precisely where they were. What's even more chilling is that these territories often contain enforcers, entities who play the role of authority figures, divine messengers, spiritual leaders, but they are not necessarily aware beings. Many are simply thought forms, energetic constructs powered by belief, existing only to maintain the illusion. They preach doctrine, they issue commands, they keep the soul in line. And the soul, conditioned to obey in life, continues to obey in death, not because it must, but because it knows nothing else. Monroe encountered souls in these realms who had been there for what felt like centuries. They had built homes, communities, spiritual bureaucracies. They prayed, studied sacred texts, waited for signs. Some believed they were in heaven, Others feared they were in hell. Both were trapped, not by punishment, but by certainty. Because in this system, certainty is the most effective form of containment. When you are certain, you stop looking, you stop asking, you stop expanding. And yet, escape is always possible. Not through obedience, not through repentance, but through awareness. The moment a soul begins to question the environment, to feel that something isn't quite right, to ask, is this really all there is? That's when cracks appear in the illusion. That's when the scaffolding begins to shake. But few reach that point, because these territories are designed to be comfortable. Even the painful ones offer a kind of psychological coherence. You suffer, but it makes sense. You're judged, but you expected it. There's a twisted comfort in predictability. It's important to understand that these realms aren't evil, they aren't malicious, they're not the product of some cosmic villain, they're the natural consequence of thought made form. In life, you're taught that belief is a virtue. In death, that virtue becomes your environment. But belief is static. It defines, it limits. And in these territories, it crystallizes into walls. This is why spiritual dogma is so dangerous, not because it's false, but because it's rigid. When you carry rigid belief into a fluid system, you trap yourself. You become incompatible with expansion. And in a universe designed for motion, that's the closest thing to death you can experience. Stagnation. Monroe found that the only way out was through inner awakening. A soul had to realize it was in a construct. It had to step back from the story and see the machinery. It had to question the very foundations of what it thought was real. And that process wasn't easy. Many resisted. Some grew angry. Others clung even harder to their beliefs, thinking they were being tested. But a few saw through. A few broke the pattern. And once they did, the environment around them began to dissolve. The thought forms vanished. The dogma crumbled. And what remained was pure awareness, ready to move on. The system never stops you from leaving, but it won't push you out either. You have to recognize the illusion for what it is. You have to see that your so-called afterlife is a mirror, not a destination. And that realization requires courage, because to leave the belief system territory is to admit that everything you were promised might not be true, that everything you obeyed might have been a script, that you were never following God, you were following a pattern, and yet, that moment of collapse is not a loss. It's liberation. It's the first breath outside the loop. It's the beginning of real movement. Because outside the belief system territories lies something far more profound, a reality not shaped by fear or faith, but by consciousness itself, a realm where you're not bound by what you were told to expect, but free to discover what actually is. The question is, will you be ready to see through? Or will you keep following the script long after the curtain has fallen? Because in this system, what you believe doesn't just shape your reality, it becomes your reality. And until you realize that, you're not free. What if I told you there's a place after death that feels like peace, but isn't heaven? A place that welcomes you, comforts you, and lets you breathe again, but doesn't keep you. A place that's not your final home, but a launch pad. A transitional space designed not to reward or punish, but to gently wake you up. That place is real. It's been described by those who've crossed over and returned. It's not a fantasy. It's a system, precise, intelligent, and deeply personal. This is where you arrive when your soul has passed through the immediate confusion of death, after the loops of unconscious repetition dissolve, after the attachments have begun to loosen, after the soul finally releases the grip of its former identity. It enters a space beyond judgment, a space where you're not cast into eternal light or darkness, but invited into awareness. It feels like a reception center, but not like anything you'd see on earth. There are no grand gates, no bearded judges, no glowing thrones. There's calm, stillness, intelligence. Not the kind that speaks in words, but in energy. And you're not alone. From the moment you enter this frequency, you're met, not by strangers, but by familiar presences, guides, beings you've known longer than you can remember. Not in this life, but across lifetimes. They don't greet you with praise or punishment, they greet you with knowing, because here, your story is not hidden, it's visible, clear, unfolding like a living tapestry. Every moment of your life becomes accessible, not as a list of deeds, but as an energetic imprint. The feelings you created in others, the love you gave or withheld, the pain you carried, the truth you ran from, it's all here, not to shame you, but to help you see. And when you do, something remarkable happens. You're not watching from the outside, you're inside each moment again. The laugh you shared with a stranger at the grocery store, the rage you felt at someone you claimed to love, the words you never said that could have changed everything, you feel it all, from every perspective, not because you're being forced to, but because this place allows total clarity. This is the Life Review. But it's not a courtroom, it's a mirror. And mirrors don't judge, they simply reflect. What you learn in this moment isn't whether you were good or bad. You learn how deeply your choices rippled, how connected everything was, how even the smallest moment was never isolated. You begin to see that every life isn't measured in accomplishments, but in energy, how much light you held, how much you gave away, how much you buried out of fear. Some souls stay in this place longer than others. It's not based on time, because time doesn't work here the way it does on Earth. It's based on readiness. Some need more reflection, some need healing. And yes, there are beings who help with that, not in the way we imagine healers or therapists, but in a purer sense. They help unbind what's still tangled. Energetic surgeons of sorts, tending not to your body, but to your memory, your residue, your frequency. These guides know you, not just from this lifetime, but across many. You've traveled with them before, and whether you remember it now or not, you've met here before. Because this place isn't new to you. It's familiar. Every soul returns here at some point, not as a reward, but as part of the process. The remarkable thing about this space, often referred to as Focus 27 by those who've mapped it, is that it isn't fixed. It reflects your level of awareness. To some, it appears as a city of light. To others, as a garden, a classroom, a sanctuary. What you see isn't the truth of the place, but your interpretation of its energy. It meets you where you are, not where you wish to be. And yet, no matter how it appears, its function remains the same. It's the center point between lives, a platform of restoration, and a place where a question gently arises: what now? Because this isn't the end, not by any stretch, and the next step isn't assigned, it's chosen. That choice depends entirely on your state of awareness. Some choose to return to Earth, to reincarnate, not because they failed, but because there's more to learn, more to experience, more to resolve. They might feel a pull toward a particular family, culture, or karmic thread that still needs to be explored. Sometimes, the return is swift. Sometimes, it takes what we perceive as centuries. Others don't go back, not right away. They move deeper, beyond the need for physical form, into realms of greater responsibility, deeper service, wider perspective. They become guides themselves. They join collectives of consciousness focused on larger patterns of evolution, assisting souls in the lower planes. These beings have been where you are. They know the pain of forgetting, and they choose to help others remember. But no one forces you to go anywhere. There's no divine hand pushing you into a womb. There's no spiritual authority deciding your fate. What exists is alignment. You go where your consciousness fits, where your frequency resonates, where your growth continues. And for some, though rare, this center becomes the final launch pad, the point from which they leave the human cycle altogether, not through escape, but through integration, because they no longer need to forget. They no longer require the friction of duality to expand. They've gathered what they came for. They've remembered fully. But for most, this place is not an exit, it's a checkpoint. And that's a beautiful thing. Because here, in this resting station, you get to pause, to breathe, to feel the enormity of your journey without being overwhelmed by it. You're not being graded, you're being supported, and more importantly, you're being invited to awaken on a deeper level. The truth is, what comes next is always up to your awareness, not your intelligence, not your status, not your spiritual vocabulary. Awareness. How awake are you to your own patterns, your attachments, your intentions? The more clearly you see, the more freely you move. And the more you understand this now, before the body drops, the more fluid your journey becomes. Because death doesn't change who you are, it just reveals it. If you're waiting to be enlightened after death, you're missing the point. This life is the training ground. This reality is where you prepare, not for judgment, not for punishment, but for movement, for choice, for clarity. So when your time comes, and it will, you'll find yourself in that reception center, surrounded by calm, clarity, and those who have walked with you across lifetimes. You'll feel peace, you'll feel seen, but you won't feel finished, because this isn't the end of your story, it's the moment you get to decide where it really begins. It's easy to believe that once the body dies, the illusions fall away, that death is some kind of reset where clarity returns, and everything suddenly makes sense. But Robert Monroe learned something radically different. The system doesn't release you just because your heart stops beating. If anything, for many souls, the grip tightens. You step out of your body only to find yourself in another layer of the same conditioning you thought you were escaping. The same programs, the same control mechanisms, the same subtle chains. Death doesn't automatically make you free, it just strips away the physical. But the mental and emotional layers, those stay with you, unless you've done the work to dismantle them before you cross over. The system wants you asleep, not because it hates you, not because it's evil in the cartoonish sense, but because it functions more smoothly when you don't ask questions, when you follow, when you accept what you see as the ultimate truth. In life, this shows up as cultural conditioning, religious indoctrination, social programming. You're taught what to believe, how to behave, what's acceptable to feel, what's dangerous to explore. From childhood, you're trained to fit into a narrative that was built long before you arrived. And most people go their entire lives without ever realizing they're inside a script. But Monroe found that this programming doesn't stop at death. It continues, it morphs, it adapts, and in many cases, it becomes even more effective because the soul no longer has the reference point of a physical body to question what's happening. You might think the non-physical world is automatically more truthful, more transparent, but the truth is, it's more malleable, more susceptible to illusion, because it responds directly to thought. And if your thoughts are conditioned, your reality will be too, even after death. Most souls don't move on because they don't know they can. They've been trained to wait for instruction, to look for external authority, to expect judgment, reward, or punishment. They think the afterlife is something that happens to them, not something they participate in. So when they find themselves in a realm that mirrors what they expected, a religious heaven, a karmic checkpoint, a symbolic courtroom, they accept it without question. And in doing so, they lock themselves into another level of the same game. The system thrives on your compliance. It doesn't have to imprison you. It just needs you to remain passive, to keep believing in hierarchies, to keep waiting for salvation from outside yourself. And the moment you try to step outside those patterns, when you start to question the scenery, challenge the beings you meet, or ask why things feel scripted, that's when resistance shows up. Not always in the form of threats or violence. Sometimes, it's just silence, a sudden fog, a distraction, a redirection back into the fold. Monroe experienced this firsthand. In his explorations, he noticed that certain questions would trigger subtle forms of interference. Beings who seemed helpful would suddenly become evasive. Information would fragment. Paths he'd previously traveled would vanish. The system was intelligent, not omniscient, but adaptive. It knew how to keep a soul entertained just long enough to prevent deeper awakening. It provided experiences that felt meaningful, but were ultimately circular. You'd have visions, revelations, even moments of transcendence, but if you looked closely, you'd see you hadn't actually moved. You'd just circled back to where you began, wrapped in a new costume of spiritual satisfaction. This kind of looping is incredibly common in the afterlife. Souls get caught in self, reflecting illusions that feel enlightening, but are built from the same mental constructs they carried from life. They confuse peace with progress, comfort with growth, affirmation with truth, and the system feeds off that confusion. not in some vampiric sense, but as a function of its design. It's efficient, predictable, organized. It runs smoother when you don't evolve too fast, when you stay in place long enough to reinforce the structures already in play. And here's where it gets even deeper. The programming isn't just about belief, it's about identity, who you think you are, what roles you cling to, what emotions you suppress or amplify. These components don't dissolve with the body, they travel with you, and they continue to shape your experience after death. If you believe you are a sinner in need of forgiveness, you'll find yourself in a realm that confirms that. If you believe you're a holy servant awaiting reward, you'll meet beings who fulfill that narrative. But all of it, every last detail, is being shaped by you and the invisible conditioning you've absorbed. This is why awareness is everything. The more awake you are, the less power the system has over you. Because awareness doesn't obey programming, it questions it, it sees through it. It recognizes the patterns, the scripts, the familiar emotional loops, and refuses to play along. And once you stop feeding the illusion with belief and emotion, it begins to dissolve. The fog lifts, the scenery breaks apart, and in that moment, you're finally able to move, not just to another location, but to a higher state of being. But make no mistake, this kind of awakening isn't common. Most souls are not prepared to question their experience after death. They're overwhelmed, or seduced, or simply uninterested. They don't recognize that what they're experiencing is a reflection of their inner state. They think it's the end point, the reward or punishment, the final chapter. And so they settle, and the system continues. That's the hidden machinery at work, an energetic ecosystem that prefers you docile, because when you're docile, you're predictable. You fit into the structure, you play the part, you repeat the cycle. And if enough souls do this for long enough, the system becomes self-reinforcing. It doesn't need external enforcement. It doesn't need a warden. The prisoners guard their own cells. But there's a crack in the system, and that crack is you, when you remember who you really are. Not your name, not your personality, not your beliefs, but the pure awareness underneath it all. The part of you that watches, that questions, that observes without judgment. That presence is immune to the program. It can't be manipulated, because it sees clearly, and the clearer you see, the less hold the system has. Monroe's journeys weren't just about charting the afterlife, they were about reclaiming consciousness, about showing that the true path of evolution doesn't begin after death. It begins the moment you start questioning the script. Not angrily, not rebelliously, but quietly, with precision, with discernment. And when you do, you become something dangerous to the system. Unpredictable. A soul that no longer fits inside the standard mold. A soul that can't be looped. So ask yourself now, not later, not after death, what parts of your mind are still running old programs? What beliefs have you accepted without ever challenging their source? What authorities have you given your power to, in life or in spirit? Because the more conscious you become of these things now, the more prepared you'll be to navigate the afterlife not as a passenger, but as a pilot. Awareness is not a luxury, it's not a spiritual bonus. It's the key to everything. Because, when the illusions fall away, and they will, only awareness will remain. And in that clarity, you won't just escape the system, you'll finally understand what lies beyond it. What if I told you that you've never been alone, on earth, in death, or in the spaces in between? That, long before you were born, long before you chose a name, a body, and a path, you were part of something larger, a group, a family. Not defined by blood or ancestry but by resonance, a shared frequency of consciousness, evolving together across lifetimes. These are not abstract concepts or romantic fantasies. They are structured, functional collectives that exist beyond the veil of physical awareness, soul groups. And within them are the true classrooms of your spiritual evolution. Imagine waking up after death, emerging from the review of your life, still vibrating with the memory of who you were. You begin to move further inward, past the reception centers and healing zones, into deeper realms of consciousness. And there, you feel it, the pull of recognition. A subtle magnetic tug toward others, not strangers, not random souls, but beings you've known far longer than your current family or friends, not by face or name, but by essence, by purpose. These are your soul group. Not all of them were with you in your last life. Not all of them chose to incarnate when you did. But they've been with you for eons, cycling through lifetimes together, taking turns as lovers, rivals, children, parents, strangers on the street, not to torment or entertain, but to catalyze, to help you grow, because that's what this whole process is about: evolution. Not the mechanical kind written in textbooks, but the expansion of awareness itself. And evolution doesn't happen in isolation. It happens through mirrors, through reflection, through tension and resonance with others. That's why soul groups exist, not as sentimental reunions, but as crucibles for transformation. In these deeper realms beyond death, you reconnect with your group, and what unfolds is not rest, but learning. Not lectures or textbooks, but immersive, energetic experiences. There are centers of understanding here, learning spaces that don't teach facts, but frequencies. In these environments, knowledge isn't transferred, it's absorbed. You step into a vibrational field, and you become the lesson. You feel the consequence of a choice from all angles. You experience an emotion not just as yourself, but as the one who received it. These aren't schools in the human sense. They are dimensional spaces crafted for integration. And the most remarkable part? You've been there before, many times. Before each incarnation, you return to these centers, with your guides, your soul group, and higher aspects of your own consciousness. You plan your next journey. Not like a scripted movie, but like a game board. You select themes to explore: abandonment, forgiveness, courage, humility. You choose the density of the challenge, the timing of major turning points. You agree to forget. That's part of the process, because remembering while inside the illusion defeats the purpose. The growth comes from rediscovering the truth inside the chaos. Some of your soul group members volunteer to play difficult roles: the antagonist, the betrayer, the one who breaks your heart. It's not cruelty, it's contract. They're playing out the friction necessary for your expansion, and when it's your turn, you do the same for them. That's the kind of trust that exists at these levels. A trust so profound, it transcends logic, because it's not based on comfort, it's based on evolution. But not every soul chooses to keep evolving. Some resist, some cling to identity, to form, to fear. And when that happens, they stay stuck. Not punished, just stagnant. Circling in lower frequencies, repeating patterns, replaying trauma in different costumes. They don't get cast out, they simply remain in alignment with the vibration they refuse to transcend. And that's where soul groups serve another purpose. Not just co-evolution, but support. When one member lags behind, the others send energy, reminders, dreams, synchronicities. They incarnate again and again, intertwining lives to offer opportunities for breakthrough. This is why you sometimes meet people in life and feel an instant connection, something deeper than chemistry, something ancient. It's because they are ancient to you. They've walked with you before. They agreed to meet you here, and whether the relationship lasts a moment or a lifetime, it's serving a function, to awaken something in you. Sometimes that awakening is soft. Sometimes it's devastating, but it's always purposeful. There are also advanced collectives, clusters of soul groups, who take on missions far beyond personal evolution. They assist in planetary shifts, technological awakenings, cross-dimensional exploration. Some incarnate together in waves, others work from non-physical realms, transmitting frequencies through art, invention, healing. These beings don't think in terms of success or failure. They think in terms of resonance. If a frequency can be anchored, it shifts the grid. That's enough. But to operate at that level, you have to move beyond the drama of identity. You have to stop seeing yourself as just a human trying to survive. You have to remember that you're part of a curriculum that stretches across time, space, and form. And in that curriculum, Earth is not the punishment, it's the proving ground. One of the most immersive, dense, challenging schools available. Souls who come here aren't weak, they're courageous, because to forget who you are, and then remember inside the noise. That takes mastery. In these soul schools, no lesson is ever wasted. Every incarnation, no matter how short or chaotic, is recorded. Not in a book, but in a vibrational imprint. You are your own living record. When you pass through the veil, all of it is there. Not just what you did, but what you learned, what you resisted, what you almost remembered. And that, almost, matters, because even near realizations plant seeds. So, what happens next? If you're aware, if you've evolved enough, you begin to make choices at a higher level. Not just about incarnating, but about serving, guiding others, expanding creation itself. You join collectives that shape new worlds, birth new species of consciousness. You move from being a student to being a builder, but only when you're ready. Only when the core of you has integrated enough light to hold that responsibility. If you're not ready, you keep going. Not as punishment, as progress. You return, maybe to Earth, maybe to another realm with different rules, but always by your own alignment. There is no divine command forcing your path. There is only resonance. And that's the truth no one teaches in life. The soul is not static. It grows, it learns, it transforms. Death doesn't stop that. It accelerates it. The only thing that slows it is clinging to roles, to stories, to beliefs that were never yours. Let go of those, and everything changes. That's what the soul groups and schools exist to teach you. Not facts or laws, but liberation. They are not there to save you. They are there to remind you that you were never trapped. You were just sleeping. And now, maybe, it's time to wake up. Robert Monroe didn't return from his journeys through the afterlife with tales of a bearded figure on a throne. No crown, no booming voice delivering commandments from some heavenly control room. What he found instead was more unnerving, because it was more real. He found structure, intelligence, a kind of cosmic architecture so intricate and precise that it couldn't possibly be accidental. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't some formless realm of drifting souls and aimless energy. There were patterns, mechanics, boundaries, and rules. And as he traveled deeper, it became clear that this entire system, this layered network of consciousness, was built, designed, not by accident and not by chance. But the more he explored, the less the question, who built it, seemed to matter. There was no signature at the bottom of the blueprint, no celestial branding, no clear creator revealing themselves as the master behind it all. And that absence wasn't empty. It was powerful. Because what became far more pressing wasn't the identity of the builder, but the purpose of the build. Not, who made this, but, why does this exist? That's the question that burned at the center of Monroe's discoveries. The architecture was real, undeniable, but what was it for? Was it a school, a test, a prison, a simulation? Or was it all of those things at once? He saw layers that resembled classrooms, zones where souls were being taught, not with textbooks or lectures, but with direct experience. Souls reliving lifetimes, examining choices, studying the ripple effects of their actions across time and space. It looked like education. But education for what? Advancement? Escape? Reintegration? The purpose wasn't always clear, and in other zones, it looked far less like a school and more like containment. Souls stuck in cycles, repeating patterns, unable to even realize they were in a loop. If that was education, it was the kind where the student didn't even know they were enrolled. Then, there were levels where everything felt artificial. Realms so perfectly constructed that they echoed Earth itself. Streets, buildings, simulated skies. Souls there believed they were still alive. They went to work, had conversations, played out routines, and yet Monroe knew they were no longer in the physical world. These were projections, realities formed to keep consciousness stable and occupied. It was like watching an immersive simulation run on autopilot. No awareness of death, no memory of transition, just endless continuity. And in those moments, the unsettling question rose again. What kind of system designs this? Who benefits from keeping souls asleep in a simulation? There was intelligence behind the structure. Of that, Monroe had no doubt. Something, or some collective force, had engineered these realms with astonishing detail. There were rules that governed movement, laws that dictated how consciousness interacted with thought, filters that determined what a soul could or could not perceive based on its awareness. It wasn't haphazard. It was ordered. But that order didn't always seem benevolent. It seemed efficient, coldly efficient. And that raised a possibility that few are willing to entertain. What if the system wasn't built for you? What if it doesn't care whether you awaken or not? What if you are not its central concern, but simply a participant within it? This is where things get uncomfortable. Because the human mind wants to believe in a loving architect, a cosmic parent, a source that only has your highest good in mind. But Monroe didn't find that. He found echoes of compassion, he found guides, he found love, but he also found control, repetition, manipulation. He encountered systems that rewarded compliance and discouraged questioning. Environments that responded negatively to souls who began to wake up too fast. Beings that intervened when awareness threatened the structure. It didn't feel like punishment. It felt like design. Design that valued containment over chaos, stability over freedom. That doesn't mean the system is inherently malevolent. It might simply be serving a function beyond what most of us can comprehend. Think of an ant in a maze. The ant doesn't need to know who built the walls. It just reacts to what's in front of it. But you're not an ant. You're a conscious being with the capacity for awareness. And with that awareness comes the ability to step back and ask, what kind of maze is this? Is it a test? A trap? A training ground? Monroe considered all of it. At times, the system resembled a school, a place for consciousness to evolve through challenge and contrast. Other times, it looked like a simulation, an elaborate virtual reality where souls play out roles, forget who they are, and try to remember through cycles of birth and death. And sometimes, it felt like a prison, a closed loop, designed to keep you distracted, looping, recycling, especially for those who never question, especially for those who fit perfectly into the mold. It's possible that all three are true, that the system is a school for those ready to learn, a simulation for those still playing the game, and a prison for those too asleep to realize they're being held. And what determines your experience may not be luck, karma, or divine favor. It may simply be awareness. The more conscious you are, the more you begin to notice the seams in the simulation, the cracks in the school walls, the soft hum of the prison machinery. And once you notice those, the game changes. Monroe wasn't given answers. He wasn't handed a cosmic rulebook. What he found were clues, patterns, evidence of a system that functions whether you acknowledge it or not. A system that continues after death. A system that responds not to prayers or rituals, but to the frequency of your consciousness. And that's the key, because if the system responds to frequency, that means it's not fixed, it's dynamic. And you can move within it, or beyond it, if you change your own vibration. That idea alone shifts everything. If you believe you're at the mercy of an external force, you remain passive. You wait, you hope, you obey. But if you realize that the system reflects your own state of awareness, then you're no longer a passenger, you're a navigator. And while you may not know who built the ship, you can learn how to steer it, or how to get off it altogether. But this takes brutal self-honesty. You have to be willing to let go of comforting stories, to stop searching for a benevolent architect and start studying the structure itself. Not with fear, but with clarity. Because if this is a school, you need to know the curriculum. If it's a simulation, you need to find the exit code. And if it's a prison, you need to remember that no cell can hold a soul that remembers who it is. So, what is the system? Maybe it's all of it. Maybe it changes based on who you are when you enter it. Maybe it was never meant to be a single thing, but a mirror, reflecting back whatever you need to see until you become what you were meant to become. Or maybe it just is, and the only real question is, what are you going to do with the knowledge that it exists? That's the question Monroe left us with, not a final answer, but a challenge. Not to believe what he saw, but to explore for ourselves. To stop waiting for death to reveal the truth and start uncovering it now, while we still have the power to shift. Because once you cross that threshold, the game doesn't end, it just changes terrain, and you'll want to be ready. What if I told you that you don't have to die to experience everything you've just read about? That the afterlife isn't waiting on the other side of your final breath. It's woven into every moment of your life right now, hidden in plain sight, beneath the noise, just behind the veil of your awareness. You've been taught that death holds the great revelations, that only in dying will you finally see clearly, finally understand, finally awaken. But the truth is more confronting. You were never supposed to wait that long. You were meant to wake up here, now. Because what you call death isn't a beginning, and it's not an end. It's a continuation, a reflection. Whatever awareness you carry when your body falls away is what you carry into the next realm. Death doesn't clean the slate, it doesn't gift you clarity, it simply amplifies what's already there. And if what's there is confusion, fear, and programming, then that's what follows you. If you want freedom on the other side, you have to cultivate it before you cross. This is why the most dangerous lie you've been told is that awakening is something you postpone, that enlightenment is something reserved for monks, saints, or your final moments, that you can live passively, unconsciously, and then somehow wake up once the game is over. But that's not how this works. The same loops that bind souls in death are the loops they refuse to break in life. The same blind spots, the same attachments, the same clinging to identity, emotion, and belief. So, let's make it clear. The stakes are not in the afterlife. The stakes are now. In every decision you make, in every moment you choose distraction over presence. In every time you suppress your intuition for the sake of fitting in, you are shaping your exit with each breath. And there will be an exit. When your body shuts down, you will find yourself in one of many states, looping, healing, reviewing, or launching. You won't be judged by a divine figure, you'll be met by your own frequency. You'll experience the mirror of your consciousness, and if your awareness is clouded, you may not even realize you've died. You may slip right into a simulation that feels exactly like the world you just left, and there you'll remain, until you remember. But you don't have to wait until that moment to begin remembering. You can start now. You must start now. Because the systems around you, the media, religion, education, culture, they aren't neutral. They are designed to keep you asleep, to keep your focus on the surface, to keep your thoughts looping in fear, guilt, anger, distraction. Because an unconscious soul is a manageable soul. A disconnected soul is easy to manipulate. But a soul who remembers, that soul becomes ungovernable. Awareness is your weapon. And it's sharper than you think. It's not about knowing spiritual terms or memorizing ancient texts. It's about watching, noticing, feeling, detaching from the automatic, becoming aware of the part of you that sees, even when the ego is loud. It's about choosing presence in the middle of the chaos, about observing the reaction without becoming the reaction, about witnessing your thoughts without mistaking them for truth. When you begin to do this, something shifts. You start to notice the simulation, the way the world is structured to keep you looping. You start to see how predictable most of your thoughts are. How many of your desires aren't even yours. How many emotions are just echoes of old programming. And in that noticing, you begin to pull your energy back. You reclaim it, piece by piece. This is the reclamation. And it doesn't happen through grand gestures. It happens through subtle revolt. You stop giving your power to institutions that demand obedience. You stop outsourcing your authority to belief systems that promise salvation. You stop pretending that comfort is worth the price of your soul's stagnation. You stop playing the role that was written for you before you could even speak. Instead, you become the observer, the traveler, the one who remembers. And remembering doesn't mean having all the answers. It means you're no longer hypnotized by the questions. You don't need to know what happens after death to live awake. You simply need to know that you're not your thoughts, not your body, not your name. You are awareness, experiencing form for a time. And that time is precious. Not because it's short, but because it determines what comes next. If you wait until death to begin your awakening, you risk repeating. You risk getting recycled, not by some external force, but by your own unresolved frequency. You go where you align. If your alignment is confusion, fear, or dependency, then you loop into spaces that mirror those states, and many do, not because they are evil or unworthy, but because they never remembered. But if you start now, if you begin peeling back the layers, dismantling the lies, reclaiming your stillness, you change the trajectory. You bring awareness into your body now, so that when you leave it, you don't need someone else to tell you what's happening. You'll know. You'll move with intention. You'll navigate with clarity. You'll bypass the illusions meant to capture drifting souls. You'll go where you choose to go. Because choice is the real power. And awareness is what makes choice possible. Without awareness, you don't choose. You react. You repeat. You follow. But with it, you begin to write your own script. You begin to move from the inside out. You begin to live in a way that transcends this body, this culture, this moment. So ask yourself, how long have you been waiting? Waiting for the right time, the right teacher, the right breakdown to wake you up? How long have you been hoping that death will offer clarity, that someone will show up and tell you what's real? That's not going to happen. Because the only one who can wake you up is you. The only one who must wake you up is you. And the time for that isn't tomorrow. It's not on your deathbed. It's now, in the middle of your distractions, in the quiet between thoughts, in the discomfort of truth. Right there, in that exact moment, you can choose to pause, to feel, to see, to remember, because the real prison isn't the world, it's the forgetfulness, and the real escape isn't in dying, it's in awakening. Now, before it's too late, Robert Monroe didn't come back from his journeys with glowing promises of paradise or prophecies wrapped in poetic light. He didn't tell people what they wanted to hear, he showed them what they needed to face. What he brought back were maps, maps of awareness, maps of the mind, maps of the soul. These weren't routes to a promised land handed down from a divine authority, they were experiential charts drawn from direct contact with the structure behind life itself. And what those maps revealed was simple, terrifying, and liberating. Death is not the end, it's the mirror. The final unveiling of everything you tried to outrun, everything you suppressed, everything you pretended not to be. In life, you can distract yourself. You can lose yourself in identity, in routine, in belief. But death strips all that away, and what's left is the raw, unfiltered state of your consciousness, facing itself. You are not your body. Monroe proved that, again and again, leaving his own behind and navigating entire realms without it. You are not your name, your job, your culture, or your past. Those things dissolve the moment you step out of this physical layer. What remains is not your story, but your frequency, your essence. And that essence determines everything that happens next. Because contrary to what you may have been told, death doesn't assign you a fate. It reflects you. And the reflection is exact. If you've built your life on avoidance, on hiding, repressing, denying, death will feel like collapse. Not because someone is punishing you, but because the veil is lifted and you are finally forced to look. The unfinished business of the soul doesn't disappear. It follows you. The lies you told yourself don't vanish. They become your surroundings. The fears you buried, the beliefs you clung to, the emotions you never processed. They shape your experience after the body falls away. Not metaphorically, literally. Monroe encountered soul after soul who didn't realize they had died. That's how seamless the transition can be. You expect a flash of light, a grand welcome, maybe even a trumpet. But many just wake up in a copy of their bedroom, or a familiar street, or a place that looks like Earth but feels off. That's the first stage of the mirror, the stage where you confront how deeply you've invested in the illusion of form. And for those who've never questioned reality while alive, this moment is disorienting. But for those who've done the work, who've looked inward, stripped back the layers, and cultivated self-awareness, it's not a collapse, it's clarity. The mirror doesn't lie, it shows you what you are. Not what you've performed, but what you've embodied. In life, you can pretend to be compassionate, spiritual, awake. You can say all the right things. You can wear the right mask. But death doesn't respond to words. It responds to vibration. You can't talk your way into the next level. You can't fake frequency. And that's what makes the mirror so ruthless, but also so fair. It shows you what you've built inside, and if you don't like what you see, it's too late to rewrite the script. You already are the script. This is the great cosmic accountability. Not judgment, but reflection. Not punishment, but precision. If you lived a life full of resentment, you'll find yourself in a realm that amplifies it. Not because someone put you there, but because you are still carrying it. If you lived in fear, you'll land where fear reigns. If you lived seeking approval, you'll be surrounded by projections that reinforce your dependence. It's all you. And it doesn't change unless you change. But here's the part most people miss. The mirror doesn't stop at death. It continues. Life is also the mirror. This reality, this moment, this identity, it's all part of the same system of reflection. You're already inside the mechanism. The death of the body is just a shift in perspective, a change in frequency. And what Monroe discovered is that the work doesn't begin after you die, it begins now. Because everything you face here, every trigger, every challenge, every emotional wound, is a rehearsal for what you'll confront there. The question isn't, what happens when I die? The question is, am I willing to face myself before that moment arrives? The beauty of this system is that once you understand how it works, you gain power. You stop trying to escape. You stop waiting for an outside force to rescue you. You stop treating death as a finish line or a punishment, and you start treating your life as a training ground. A place to refine your awareness, to clean your energy, to align with truth. Not because you're afraid of hell, but because you understand that the more clearly you see, the less you repeat. Because that's the other truth Monroe uncovered. If you don't see through the illusion, you come back. Maybe not as the same person, maybe not even in the same kind of world, but you return. Not out of karma in the traditional sense, not because you failed, but because you didn't finish. The loop starts again, the conditions shift, but the unresolved parts of you remain. And so the mirror reforms. A new scenario, a new body, a new chance to awaken, until one day, you do. The system isn't cruel, it's exact. It gives you what you need to see, again and again. And once you see it, truly see it, you begin to move. You stop circling. You stop seeking comfort in belief systems or external authorities. You start walking your own path through the labyrinth. You become your own guide. And eventually, you pass through the final veil, not into paradise or oblivion, but into awareness, pure, self-sustaining awareness. The kind that no longer needs mirrors, because there's nothing left to reflect. You are whole. That's the invitation Monroe left behind. Not to believe him, not to worship his discoveries, but to wake up now, to start peeling back the stories, the identities, the unquestioned assumptions, to stop outsourcing your evolution to religion, culture, or spiritual trends, and to recognize that the most powerful preparation for death is radical honesty in life. You don't have to wait for the body to fail to meet the mirror. It's already here. Every interaction, every trigger, every longing, every moment of stillness, it's all part of the reflection. And the more you engage with it consciously, the more you begin to reshape your post-death experience. You're not at the mercy of fate, you're sculpting it. Every thought, every choice, every act of self-awareness. So, when the moment comes, and it will, you won't be confused, you won't be afraid. You'll step through the veil like stepping through a doorway into a room you've already visited in dreams. And instead of panic, you'll feel recognition. Instead of fog, you'll see clarity. And instead of being pulled into the loop again, you'll choose freely, fully, finally. Because the mirror never punishes. It just waits for you to see. And once you do, you're no longer trapped inside the reflection. You become the light that shapes it.